Ladies and gentlemen, I need you to sit down for this one. What I'm about to tell you sounds like something ripped straight from a political thriller novel, except it's not fiction. It's happening right now in real time, and the implications for North American geopolitics are absolutely staggering. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that a significant portion of one of America's closest allies is actively negotiating with Washington to break away and form its own independent nation. Now, imagine that the Trump administration isn't just passively observing this development, but is actively encouraging it, backing it with promises of financial support that would make your head spin. We're talking about $500 billion, folks. 500 billion with a B. This isn't some fringe conspiracy theory being whispered in dark corners of the internet. This is real, it's documented, and it's moving forward with breathtaking speed. I'm George Conway, and I've spent decades analyzing political movements, constitutional law, and the sometimes bizarre twists and turns of democratic governance. But I have to tell you, in all my years of observing politics on both sides of the border, I have never seen anything quite like what's unfolding right now between certain elements of the Alberta provincial government and the Trump White House. The Alberta Prosperity Project, an organization that has been pushing for Alberta's independence from Canada, has reportedly completed its third meeting with Trump administration officials at the State Department level. And what they're claiming came out of those meetings should concern every single person who cares about the stability of North American relations, the integrity of democratic processes, and the future of our closest trading partner and ally. Let me be crystal clear about what we're dealing with here. This isn't just some academic discussion about theoretical independence movements. According to Jeffrey Rath, one of the leaders of this independence organization, these meetings are taking place in SCIFs, which stands for Sensitive Compartmented Information Facilities. These are the secure rooms where the most classified conversations in the United States government take place. The people they're meeting with, according to Rath himself, go directly from these meetings to the Oval Office. Think about that for a moment. The leader of a separatist movement from a Canadian province is claiming to have a direct pipeline to the President of the United States through intermediaries who brief him personally. Whether or not every detail of these claims is accurate, the mere fact that these meetings are happening at all represents a seismic shift in how the United States is approaching its relationship with Canada. The substance of what was allegedly discussed in these meetings is even more remarkable. We're talking about a proposed $500 billion line of credit that would be backed by Alberta's oil reserves. We're talking about guarantees for Alberta pensioners, including converting their pensions from Canadian to American dollars at par. We're talking about pipeline routes through American states like Idaho, Montana, Washington, and Oregon to give an independent Alberta access to Pacific markets. This is comprehensive nation-building support we're discussing here. The United States government, if these reports are accurate, is essentially offering to serve as the financial backbone of a breakaway Canadian province. The Trump administration is reportedly positioning itself to provide everything a new country would need to survive the inevitable economic warfare that would follow a unilateral declaration of independence. Now, I want to take a step back and provide some important context here. Alberta's grievances with the Canadian federal government are not new, and they're not entirely without merit. This is a province that has been sending billions of dollars more to Ottawa than it receives back for decades. We're talking about $653 billion in net contributions since 1980, according to Alberta's own premier. That's a staggering amount of money flowing out of one province to support others. Albertans have watched as their oil and gas industries have been subjected to what they view as punitive regulations and deliberate obstruction by federal authorities. They've seen pipeline projects blocked, their primary products landlocked, and their economic interests systematically subordinated to what they perceive as the political preferences of Eastern Canada. The frustration is real, the anger is genuine, and dismissing these concerns as mere provincial whining would be a serious mistake. But here's where things get truly complicated, and where my deep concerns about this entire situation begin to crystallize. The framing being used by the Alberta Prosperity Project and apparently being embraced by elements of the Trump administration goes far beyond legitimate economic grievances. Jeffrey Rath explicitly invokes the Monroe Doctrine, that 19th century American policy declaring the Western Hemisphere to be within the United States sphere of influence and off limits to European powers. He characterizes the Canadian federal government's policies as being conducted at the behest of Communist China. He presents Alberta independence not as a domestic Canadian political question, but as a matter of American national security, positioning the liberation of Alberta's oil fields as a strategic imperative to counter Chinese influence. This is extraordinary rhetoric, and it should give every thoughtful observer pause about what's really happening here. When I first started looking into the details of these reported meetings between the Alberta Prosperity Project and the Trump administration, my initial instinct was to follow the money. In my experience, whenever you're trying to understand a complex political situation, the financial arrangements usually tell you more than any press release or public statement ever could. And what I found when I examined the proposed financial structure of this independent scheme was simultaneously impressive in its scope and deeply troubling in its implications. We're not talking about vague promises of moral support or diplomatic recognition. We're talking about a concrete, detailed financial architecture designed to make Alberta's independence economically viable from day one. The centerpiece of this financial arrangement is the proposed $500 billion line of credit. Let me explain how this would work in practice because the details matter enormously. According to Jeffrey Rath's own description, this credit facility would be backed by Alberta's oil and gas reserves as collateral. The moment a referendum succeeded and Alberta declared its intention to separate from Canada, this massive line of credit would be triggered. The purpose, as Rath explained it, is to ensure that Alberta can negotiate with Ottawa from a position of strength rather than weakness. In other words, when the Canadian federal government inevitably attempts to use economic pressure to prevent or reverse the separation, Alberta would have access to enough American financial firepower to weather any storm. The full faith and credit of the United States Treasury would effectively be standing behind the new Republic of Alberta. Think about what this means from a strategic perspective. Canada's primary leverage over any separatist province would traditionally be economic. A province that tries to leave would face the prospect of being cut off from federal transfer payments, excluded from trade agreements, denied access to financial systems, and subjected to every form of economic pressure Ottawa could bring to bear. These are not abstract concerns. When Quebec came close to separating in 1995, the federal government made very clear that the economic consequences would be severe. But with a $500 billion American backstop, all of that leverage essentially evaporates. Alberta could thumb its nose at Ottawa, secure in the knowledge that Washington has its back. This isn't just financial support. This is the United States government effectively declaring that it will shield a breakaway Canadian province from any consequences of its decision to leave. The pension conversion discussion is equally revealing. One of the most powerful tools any government has to maintain the loyalty of its citizens is the promise of retirement security. Pensions represent decades of work, years of contributions, and the expectation of a dignified old age. By offering to convert Alberta pensions from Canadian to American dollars at par, the Trump administration would be directly addressing one of the most potent fears that any separatist movement has to overcome. Albertans considering independence wouldn't have to worry about whether their life savings would be worth anything in a new country with an uncertain currency. They'd know that the most powerful economy on earth was guaranteeing their retirement security. This is sophisticated political strategy, folks. Someone has thought very carefully about how to make separation as painless as possible for ordinary Albertans. And then there's the pipeline. Oh, the pipeline. If you want to understand why the Trump administration might be so enthusiastic about Alberta independence, you need to understand the significance of what they're proposing here. Alberta sits on the third largest oil reserves in the world. It's an absolutely massive quantity of petroleum, but it's effectively landlocked. The Canadian federal government has blocked or delayed multiple pipeline projects that would allow Alberta to export its oil to international markets. The Keystone XL pipeline, which Trump himself championed, was killed by the Biden administration and has been a source of ongoing frustration. But an independent Alberta allied with the United States could simply bypass all of Canada's environmental objections and regulatory obstacles. The proposed pipeline would run from Alberta through Idaho or Montana, then through Washington or Oregon to reach the Pacific coast. From there, Alberta oil could flow to Japan, South Korea, and other Asian markets that currently depend heavily on Middle Eastern suppliers. This is where Rath's rhetoric about Chinese influence starts to make a certain kind of sense, even if I find it deeply problematic. His argument, which he claims the Trump administration shares, is that China benefits from keeping Alberta oil landlocked because it prevents Japan and South Korea from developing alternative energy supplies. By this logic, freeing Alberta from Canadian control isn't just about provincial autonomy or economic fairness. It's about countering Chinese strategic influence in the Pacific. Whether or not you find this argument convincing, and I have serious reservations about it, you can see why it would appeal to an administration that has made confronting China a central pillar of its foreign policy. Alberta independence in this framing isn't a Canadian domestic issue at all. It's a front in the broader great power competition between the United States and China. But I have to be honest with you about my concerns here because I think they're important. What we're seeing is the United States government, or at least significant elements within it, actively working to destabilize and potentially dismember one of our closest allies. Canada has stood with the United States through 2 world wars, the Cold War, Korea, Afghanistan, and countless other conflicts. Canadians and Americans share the longest undefended border in the world, have deeply integrated economies, and have been friends and partners for generations. And now we're watching American officials meet in secure facilities with people whose explicit goal is to break Canada apart. Whatever grievances Alberta may have with Ottawa, and again, some of them are legitimate, is this really how the United States should be conducting itself toward its allies? One of the most fascinating aspects of this entire Alberta independence saga, and one that deserves careful examination, is the legal framework within which it would potentially unfold. Unlike many countries where any talk of secession is treated as inherently illegitimate or even treasonous, Canada actually has a well-established legal pathway for provincial separation. This makes the Canadian situation genuinely unique in the world, and it's something that the Alberta Prosperity Project is clearly counting on as they make their case to potential supporters. Understanding this legal context is essential to grasping both the opportunities and the challenges that lie ahead for anyone seriously contemplating Alberta independence. The key piece of legislation here is something called the Clarity Act, which was passed by the Canadian Parliament in the year 2000. This law emerged directly from the experience of the 1995 Quebec referendum, where the separatist side came within a percentage point of winning. In the aftermath of that near miss, the Canadian government asked the Supreme Court to rule on whether Quebec could unilaterally declare independence. The court's response, issued in 1998, was nuanced and carefully balanced. It said that while no province has a unilateral right to secede under either Canadian or international law, if a clear majority of a province's population voted yes in response to a clear question on secession, this would create a democratic mandate that the federal government would be obligated to respect. Negotiations over the terms of separation would have to follow. The Clarity Act codified this principle into law. It establishes that any province can pursue separation through a referendum, but the question must be clear and unambiguous. No more of the convoluted wording that characterized the 1995 Quebec question, which critics said was deliberately confusing. If a clear question is asked and a clear majority answers yes, then negotiations between the province and the federal government must begin. The Act doesn't specify what percentage constitutes a clear majority, leaving that determination to Parliament, which has created some ambiguity. But the fundamental principle is established in Canadian law. Peaceful, legal secession is possible if the democratic will is clearly expressed. This is the legal foundation upon which the Alberta Prosperity Project is building its strategy. As one of the constitutional lawyers associated with the movement explained, there's a legal way to do this. Albertans don't have to take up arms. They can pursue independence through the ballot box following established constitutional procedures. This is a powerful argument because it allows independence supporters to present themselves not as radicals or revolutionaries, but as citizens exercising their democratic rights within the existing legal framework. They're not trying to overthrow anything. They're just asking their fellow Albertans to vote on their collective future. But here's where I think the situation becomes considerably more complex than the independence advocates might want to acknowledge. Yes, the Clarity Act establishes a legal pathway for separation negotiations, but it doesn't guarantee that those negotiations will succeed or that separation will actually occur. The federal government would be obligated to negotiate in good faith, but it would also be obligated to represent the interests of the rest of Canada. Questions about the division of federal assets and debts, about minority rights, about indigenous treaties, about territorial boundaries, about citizenship and nationality, all of these would have to be resolved through negotiation. And there's no guarantee that Ottawa and Edmonton would be able to reach agreement on any of these incredibly complex issues. Furthermore, the involvement of the United States government in this process raises profound questions about democratic legitimacy that I don't think the independence movement has adequately addressed. When Jeffrey Rath talks about the Trump administration's enthusiastic support for Alberta independence, when he describes meetings in secure government facilities with officials who report directly to the president, when he outlines a $500 billion financial backstop that would allow Alberta to negotiate with Ottawa from a position of strength, what he's describing isn't just a domestic Canadian political debate. It's a situation where a foreign power is actively working to influence the outcome of a democratic process in a neighboring country. The very same United States that has expressed outrage over alleged foreign interference in its own elections is now apparently providing material support to a movement seeking to dismember an allied nation. I want to be very careful here because I believe strongly in the right of peoples to determine their own political destiny. If Albertans genuinely want independence, if they hold a free and fair referendum with a clear question and a clear majority votes yes, then I believe that outcome should be respected. But that democratic mandate has to be genuine. It has to emerge from the authentic political will of Albertans themselves, not from the financial inducements and strategic calculations of a foreign government pursuing its own interests. When the Trump administration dangles a $500 billion credit line in front of Alberta, when it promises to convert pensions at par, when it offers pipeline access and economic partnerships, it's not just passively supporting a democratic movement. It's actively shaping the conditions under which that democratic choice will be made. And we have to ask ourselves some hard questions about what motivates this American interest in Alberta independence. Is it really about respecting Albertan democracy? Is it about countering Chinese influence, as Jeffrey Rath suggests? Or is it about something much simpler and more self-interested? Alberta's oil reserves are among the largest in the world. An independent Alberta aligned with the United States would give American energy companies and American strategic planners access to those resources on terms that would be far more favorable than anything they could get from a unified Canada. The Monroe Doctrine, which Rath himself invoked, isn't about respecting the self-determination of other peoples. It's about American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. It's about ensuring that the resources and strategic positions of this continent serve American interests. As I sit here contemplating everything I've learned about the Trump administration's apparent involvement with the Alberta independence movement, I find myself wrestling with a profound sense of unease about where all of this might lead. We're not talking about some theoretical possibility in the distant future. According to Jeffrey Rath and the Alberta Prosperity Project, they're actively working toward a referendum in 2026. That's not decades away. That's potentially less than 2 years from now. And if the reporting on these State Department meetings is accurate, the groundwork for American support of an independent Alberta is being laid right now at this very moment in secure government facilities in Washington. Let me walk you through what I believe could unfold if this movement continues to gain momentum. First, we would likely see an intensification of the political campaign within Alberta itself. The independence movement would use the promise of American backing to reassure skeptical voters that separation wouldn't mean economic catastrophe. They would point to the proposed line of credit, the pension guarantees, the pipeline commitments, all of it designed to demonstrate that an independent Alberta would be immediately viable as a nation. The strategy, as one of the movement's lawyers explained, is to focus on that middle third of the population, the people who aren't committed partisans on either side. By presenting independence as financially secure and legally legitimate, they hope to move those persuadable voters into the yes column. If this campaign succeeds and a referendum is scheduled, the dynamics between Ottawa and Edmonton would become incredibly tense. The Canadian federal government would face an agonizing dilemma. On one hand, any attempt to prevent the referendum or to delegitimize it would play directly into the narrative that Ottawa doesn't respect Alberta's democratic rights. The Clarity Act exists precisely to establish that Canadians can peacefully vote on their constitutional future. Trying to block that process would be seen as hypocritical and authoritarian, potentially driving more Albertans toward the independence camp. But on the other hand, simply allowing the referendum to proceed while the Trump administration openly supports one side would feel like acquiescing to foreign interference in Canadian democracy. And then there's the question of what happens if the referendum actually passes. Let's say Alberta holds a vote with a clear question and a clear majority, whatever that means, votes yes. Under the Clarity Act, Ottawa would be obligated to negotiate. But what exactly would those negotiations look like when one side has the explicit backing of the United States government and access to a $500 billion credit line? The normal give and take of negotiation depends on both sides having something to lose. Alberta would traditionally have to worry about economic isolation, about being locked out of trade agreements, about its currency collapsing, about all the 100 different ways that separation could go wrong economically. But with American backing, none of those concerns would have the same force. Alberta could simply say no to any terms it didn't like, secure in the knowledge that Washington would catch it if it fell. This creates what I believe is an incredibly dangerous dynamic. Canada would essentially be negotiating not just with Alberta, but with the United States. And the power imbalance between those two parties is enormous. What leverage would Ottawa have when the other side is backed by the most powerful economy on earth? Would Canada try to punish Alberta economically anyway, risking a direct confrontation with the Trump administration? Would it simply capitulate to whatever terms Alberta demanded, setting a precedent that any province backed by a foreign power can effectively dictate terms to the Federation? Neither option is attractive, and both could lead to outcomes that are destabilizing for the entire Canadian Confederation. I also think we need to consider the precedent this sets for other separatist movements around the world. What the Trump administration is apparently doing in Alberta is not subtle. They're meeting with separatist leaders in secure facilities, promising massive financial support, offering to underwrite the creation of a new nation carved out of an allied country. If this succeeds, what's to stop other powers from doing the same thing elsewhere? What if China decided to back separatist movements in American allies? What if Russia, which has already been accused of supporting various secessionist groups, felt emboldened to intensify those efforts? The principle that major powers don't actively work to dismember friendly nations has been a cornerstone of international stability since the end of World War II. If the United States openly abandons that principle with Canada, why would anyone else feel bound by it? There's also a deeply troubling aspect to the rhetoric being used by the Alberta Prosperity Project and apparently echoed by their American interlocutors. Jeffrey Rath characterizes the Canadian federal government's policies as being carried out at the behest of the communist Chinese. He frames Alberta's landlocked resources as a Chinese strategic victory. He presents American support for independence as part of a broader great power competition with China. This kind of language isn't just hyperbolic, it's dangerous. It transforms a legitimate domestic political dispute about federalism, resource management, and regional equity into an ideological battle between freedom and communism, between American allies and Chinese puppets. Once you've framed your political opponents as agents of a hostile foreign power, compromise becomes impossible. How do you negotiate in good faith with people you've characterized as traitors serving communist interests? I've spent a lot of time thinking about what advice I would give to Albertans who are genuinely frustrated with their treatment by the federal government. And I want to be clear that I take those frustrations seriously. $653 billion in net contributions to the Federation since 1980 is not a trivial amount of money. Watching pipeline projects get blocked while your primary industry struggles is genuinely painful. Feeling like your concerns are dismissed by Eastern elites who don't understand or care about your way of life is a real grievance that deserves to be addressed. But I would urge Albertans to think very carefully about what they would be getting into if they follow the path the Alberta Prosperity Project is laying out. An independent Alberta backed by the Trump administration might seem appealing in the short term. American money, American support, freedom from Ottawa's interference. But what happens when that relationship becomes one of dependency rather than partnership? The United States isn't offering this support out of altruism or respect for Albertan self-determination. It's offering this support because it sees strategic advantage in it. Alberta's oil, Alberta's resources, Alberta's strategic position. These are what Washington cares about. Once those resources are tied to American credit facilities and American pipelines and American markets, how much real independence would Alberta actually have? You'd be trading one set of constraints from Ottawa for another set of constraints from Washington, except the new boss would be a lot bigger and a lot more powerful than the old one. Moreover, I worry about what this movement means for the fabric of Canadian society more broadly. Canada is a remarkable country in many ways. It has managed to hold together a vast, diverse, multilingual, multicultural federation across some of the most challenging geography on Earth. It has done so through compromise, negotiation, and a fundamental commitment to working out differences through democratic means rather than through force or foreign intervention. The Clarity Act itself is an expression of that commitment. It says that if the democratic will is clearly expressed, the country will adapt. But what happens when one party to that democratic process is backed by a foreign superpower that has its own agenda? What happens when the money and influence of the world's most powerful nation are thrown onto one side of the scale? Is that really democratic self-determination anymore? I don't have all the answers. I wish I did. But I know that what we're watching unfold between the Trump administration and the Alberta independence movement is something genuinely unprecedented in North American history. The United States government is actively working to create the conditions for one of our closest allies to break apart. Whether you support Alberta independence or oppose it, whether you think the Trump administration's approach is brilliant realpolitik or reckless adventurism, I think everyone should be paying very close attention to what happens next, because the consequences of this gambit for Alberta, for Canada, for the United States, and for the entire international order could be profound and lasting in ways that none of us can fully predict. This is George Conway, and I'll be watching this story very carefully in the months ahead. I suggest you do the same. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.